All right, what's up, guys? Back again with another formulation review. Glad to be joined here again by formulation expert Xander.
Yes, it's good to be here. This time I am right, and this is actually a formulation review, and we're not going to do the podcast again. So,
Perfect. All right, well, basically the theme for today is programming, how to formulate items for programming, because basically I've just been reflecting on the past 1.5 years or so of using SuperMemo and getting really stuck into programming. And yeah, this was like the first time I decided to actually go back and look at some of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And actually, most of them are ugly, as you can see from especially from the templating, but also in terms of the formulation. And basically, what I've done is I've decided to put the worst at the beginning, and then hopefully, slowly, as we move through, they should get better and better towards the end. None of them are great.
I'm skeptical of that.
Yeah. As you should be, my friend. All right. You know what? Enough babbling. Let's just get straight into it. So,
All right.
one more thing. Throughout this sort of formulation review, one of the things I'm going to keep coming back to is the notion that there are sort of two main ways that an item can contribute to your life. And the first one is by saving you time. By learning something, it could make it so that you don't need to go and type it into Google and find the definition of something. So you save like 30 seconds. So there's sort of like a time saving aspect to items, right? And then on the other hand, there's also another aspect, which is the association bonus, which is harder to define, harder to quantify, but might be much more valuable. And by association bonus, essentially what I mean is by retaining an item and keeping it in your memory over time, you might be able to combine it with something else in your memory to generate a new idea that could result in, for example, a new scientific breakthrough. Perhaps it gives you a startup idea and you become a billionaire, that sort of thing. Or, it contributes to some creative goal. Would you agree with those two sort of aspects, Xander, generally?
Yeah, I would just say I would add like a sub point to number 2, which is an association isn't only a creative thing. Most understanding is a result, perhaps all understanding, but I haven't thought deeply enough about it to ensure that. But most of it is a result of combining prior knowledge with current stuff.
Right.
So
right.
you can't. The thing about complex concepts is that they're built of many sub-concepts that are much simpler. And oftentimes you're using prior knowledge to build up your understanding. So I'll just make the caveat that association isn't only creative new ideas. It's often just understanding something. And if you don't think that memory is required to understand something complex, I won't make fun of you, but I ask that you think of it more.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, those are the two main ways that I've sort of decided to split sort of the value you get from items into today. And this was basically inspired by an article that wrote, and it was actually an article on using SuperMemo for programming. And it was an article he wrote, I think it's like back in the 90s or something like that. And that's essentially what he does. He decomposes the value from items into these two things, the time you gain from not having to look things up and the bonus you get from associativity. And so, you know what, let's just jump straight into the first item. And this is pretty much like a very good example of one that maybe doesn't really fall into either of the two categories. So it almost immediately breaks the sort of framework that I laid out at the beginning. So essentially this item on the question, it says DNS stands for, and then close marker, and the answer is domain naming system. And so I don't know, this is the kind of item that I really can't get very excited about at all, because it just seems like kind of trivia to me almost. In the sense that knowing that DNS stands for domain naming system, it isn't super valuable, and it's also not really going to save you a lot of time in terms of needing to look it up on Google. Those are my two initial impressions. The only reason I could see it being sort of valuable, and has talked about this before in a different context. So let's say you're reading an article about HTTP, and you're sort of learning about how it works, the protocol, whatever. If you come across that word DNS, and perhaps you don't have anything to link it to in your memory, you don't know what the acronym stands for, you don't know what it means, WAS has this concept of a decoding failure penalty. So not having anything to relate DNS to in your prior knowledge might cause you to sort of, you almost become tired reading that article. You start to feel like, oh man, I don't really understand anything. So this is really scraping the bottom of the barrel, trying to defend this item as having any value at all. But that is basically the only value I could see it having, is that it wouldn't, by knowing this item, if you come across DNS in a future article, you wouldn't face the sort of decoding failure penalty. You wouldn't feel like confused reading that article almost, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle to believe that simply remembering what it stands for would make any significant difference. It's possible, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm skeptical of this kind of thing for a few reasons. One, like you say, this is the type of thing where it's almost like when you hear writers talk about how they, shine their shoes and clean their house to avoid writing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I view this as the item equivalent of that. It's like, I don't want to make any items about the truly difficult stuff or the stuff that would be actually interesting, because that would be hard.
Right.
And so I'll just pick one that would be really easy to close.
Exactly.
And I think most closes are that. People are looking for closes.
Yeah.
Words that look like they can be closed.
Hunting
and then
for
they just go,
closables.
boom, look at that. I made a new item.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, great. You made this new item that you only made to avoid making actually good items. So congratulations. But anyway, I do think this is that. And I also think this is the type of item that's easy to make if you don't actually understand what the thing is. So if you don't know anything about DNS, the odds that you'll get any value from this item alone is really low.
Exactly.
But if you know a lot about DNS, then yeah, I guess it makes sense to remember this. That would be my thought on it.
Yeah, I agree with all.
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, I agree with all of those. And I wanted to highlight one of the things you brought out, which was the hunting for closables thing. I really like that concept because it's a very common failure pattern that, I've observed myself doing obviously a lot, as you'll continue to see during this formulation review. And you also see a lot of other people doing it. Once you first start using Anki or SuperMemo and you realize that you can create flashcards very quickly using the close deletion thing, you suddenly close anything that can be closable, which is often a mistake. Yeah.
And you know what I think that's a result of? People are implicitly making a goal, sometimes explicitly, of making as many items as they can. But that's a silly goal. The actual goal should be, I want to understand as many things as possible, right?
Yeah.
I want to be able to do as many things as possible. That should be the goal. You should only make an item because there's some value to it, not because of some arbitrary thing. Oh, I should make, more items, as many items as I can.
Yeah.
If I make 30 items in one day, that's better than 15. You know what I mean? So I think it's that kind of mindset that leads to this. And it's also, I just want to know, this is not all bad. If this is like getting the ball rolling for you and sort of expanding your willingness to create items about DNS or just items in general or whatever it is, I don't think that's bad. And also, just to defend the other side of it, my intuition is that people would say, well, this item is going to be so low cost that why not do it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there could be some benefits, like you say, of avoiding a decoding failure penalty as a result of this simple item. So those are some possible benefits. Overall, I don't think this is ideal because it leaves the false impression of added understanding and utility. So anyway.
All right, I think we should move on to the next one. This is an example of something that I did a lot at the beginning when I was just starting out learning programming with spaced repetition. So essentially, the question side of the card gives me like a prompt, and then the answer, I actually have to type in what the line of code would be to delete the first element of the list. And so in this example, I think this is from Python. So that's another mistake that I made at the beginning, is thinking that I would only ever use one programming language, and then not making it clear which one actually I was like referring to in the question. And that became kind of chaotic over time. But I generally found these cards to be, sometimes they're okay, but most of the time typing in typing in these sorts of answers that focus more on like the syntax than the conceptual side of things, they don't really they don't offer me much benefit beyond 6 months after learning a programming language, if you know what I mean. So once you've been sort of immersed using a programming language to do your own projects for 6 to 12 months, something like this is going to be very trivial to you. And actually, in fact, I don't think I've ever really used this. I think the answer is like Dell motorcycles brackets 0 or something like that, right? To delete the first index, right? I don't think I've actually ever used that ability. I've just never needed to delete like an element from a list. It's just I've used Python a bunch. I've literally just never needed to use that function. So that was another mistake as well as a beginner, trying to encode everything that you come across as an item before you realize that something is actually valuable and worth retaining across your entire life. Like, I wonder if this is going too far, Xander, but do you think that when you're making items, you should be thinking in terms of your entire lifetime? Like, is this thing going to be useful to me? Because I think if I'd thought that when I was making this item, I probably wouldn't have made it.
Well, I think it's impossible to think that way, actually. If you had asked me at 18 years old, what's going to happen to you in the next 4 years, there is zero chance that I would have guessed almost any of it.
Right.
And so I just don't think that that's a feasible thing to do. So things happen in life that are very strange. Go ahead.
What if someone went back in time and told you that you were going to be running the world's premier SRS podcast?
I would have believed that. I would have even been able to intuit that it would have been with my great British friend James, who I hadn't even met yet. I would have felt that. I would have felt the energy from the universe, and I would have been able to predict that. Beautiful. That's how powerful this is. This podcast transcends space and time. It's like in that movie Interstellar, when he falls into that thing and everything is always happening. This podcast is always happening. From the beginning of the universe, this podcast is going.
Oh, beautiful. Well,
anyway, so yeah, I think the thing that I think about these kind of items is, okay, let's say that you were actually coding something that you were trying to make, and you go, oh, I need to delete an item from that list. If you Googled Python delete item from list, you could find that, right? You could find it easily. And then if you use that sufficiently often, it's going to be essentially no time. And so my primary concern with coding items is things that I tried to do that took me longer than I thought they should have. And so it took me longer than I expected to find some method that I needed to do a particular thing. And so I say, okay, what is the method to do this? Or what approach could I take to do this? Or how did I solve this bug? What realization led me to be able to solve this bug? You know what I mean? Those are the kinds of things that I'm interested in so that I can actually save time. And also, I'll point out another thing about this item. It's actually too specific. There's a more general principle, which is if you want to delete an item from a list, you just pass the list and you get the list and then you pass the index of the key you want to delete. So I think there's a more general item to be made there, like how do you delete an item from a list in Python? The answer is delete list and then key. You know what I mean? So that's the or index, and so I think that's the more general idea at play there. Of course, you can have a particular example of it, maybe in parentheses or something if that helps. But those are the two problems I see with that. And yeah, when you're a beginner at programming or beginner at anything, you don't know what's useful actually, and so you often tend to be a little bit overzealous and make too many items. And so one of the things that people should do is remain flexible. If something appears boring or no longer useful, just delete it. It doesn't matter. Like, everybody gets caught up in like, oh, I already made this item, it's worth it to keep it, but it's not. It doesn't matter. What's more worth it is actually enjoying when you're doing your reviews. And if you're bored or if you're a little bit averse to some subset of your items, over time that's going to erode your energy for the whole review itself, and I don't think that's worth it. So just delete it if you discover later on that it's not worth it.
Yeah, you've definitely got to get into that mindset of being willing to delete things early. Like if you do get into that mindset, then experimentation with new types of items and items that you're not sure will be good can become very low cost. So that once you create an environment or a learning sort of situation where you're experimenting and not like risking putting in like 6 months of effort, wasted effort potentially, that's a very good thing, because it means that, you know, those experiments that do turn out to be successful, you can continue doing and continue to gain from over time. And those ones that fail, you can just, you know, delete those items. You might have only spent like 30 seconds on them or whatever so far. So it's not that much lost in terms of time.
Right. And also, what I mentioned about taking items from your own coding process, that the memories for that work much better because they're actually connected to something that you use. Whereas I doubt you're a motorcycle enthusiast building apps about motorcycles.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that is the big problem of these really contrived exercises when you're a beginner. You can see that this is from Python Crash Course Chapter 2. You know, it's one of these beginner articles, super contrived, boring problems, nothing really to get you interested. If you did what Xander's saying right now, you take examples from your own code, that's going to be much more meaning for you. It's connected to your episodic memories. It's already integrated into your prior knowledge. So
yeah, exactly. It's so much better. And I've made some of those items. I don't exactly know how many, but they work perfectly for me.
Very nice. All right, moving on. Yeah, it's another terrible one. This is especially bad because, you know, I was saying before that sort of the value of that item might expire after 6 months because you'd be familiar with the most common operations in that programming language. This is the kind of item that would be valuable for like 2 hours if you use HTML at all. You know, especially given that the image, I mean, just in case no one has used HTML before, the image tag is literally just like open bracket img close bracket. So it's like, it's already semantic. It's already supposed to be it literally is. HTML is a semantic markup language, so it's like it's been made for you to easily sort of be able to read it and understand it to a certain extent. So this is like this is like the perfect example of just a completely useless item. I doubt it was very costly. That's the only probably good thing that could be said of it. But yeah.
Well, I will say also, this item actually, unless you have other items for this, I don't know if you do or not, but it actually has no use because just knowing that the image tag is how you make an image. I'll ask you now, maybe you know this offhand because you've learned it already. Do you know how do you determine what image is shown in that image tag?
I think it's the source, right? The source attribute.
Yeah, so the source attribute. So without knowing that piece of information, you can't make any use of the image tag. And so of course this item would still be good if you had other items about the image tag and what attributes it accepts and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's already very semantic, and if you use HTML with any regularity at all, you're gonna know. Like, it would be, I think, for the rest of my life, I'll remember how to put an image into HTML, even if I never wrote any more HTML, because it's so ingrained in me. It would be impossible to get rid of it.
Right.
But also, it's so low cost, and it actually would have value if you were trying to learn HTML. So in the beginning, it's probably not a bad item. And then once you actually start writing HTML, just give it a forgetting index of like 20% and chuck it a few years into the future. And then it'll be almost no cost.
Yes, I completely agree. All right, let's move on. And I will say that we're starting to get into the ones that I feel a little bit more confident about. These ones I feel are more useful because they tackle more of the conceptual side of programming. They start getting into perhaps even more of the sort of computer science side of things, less of the practical and more of the conceptual, which I've tended to find to be like a little bit more useful. So, for example, this one, the question is, in the early days of high-level programming languages, only data or process abstraction was included. And the answer is process abstraction. And the reason I like this is because it doesn't ask you directly about the history of programming languages, but by answering it, I don't know, it just feels like it's very much integrated into my understanding of, you know, the history of programming languages, where initially people packaged up code to be reused into functions. So you had process abstraction, and then over time you had the development of object-oriented programming languages and stuff like that, which were more about
Mm.
packaging up into data plus process abstraction. And so you started having data abstraction on top of process abstraction, if that makes sense. But
Mm.
yeah, I like this one more. It sort of gives you a sense of the development of things over time, and it's a little bit more conceptual.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because most of the interesting stuff you said there was actually not within the item. It was the implications of it.
Right.
And so I would hope that you have, and again, this is one of the problems with like reviewing other people's items. It would be like if you're a personal trainer and somebody, sent you one meal a year that they ate.
Yeah.
And they said, "Do you think I'm doing good on my diet?" And it's like, well, come on, dude. I barely know anything. Like, it's ridiculous. It would be impossible to analyze the fullness of the quality of an item if you only saw one. So anyway, that's a problem with this. But yeah, I hope you have items about the implications of that. And if you do, I think because of the way this is phrased, it probably is good. Although I am a little bit skeptical. Like, in the early history of high-level programming languages, so you would need to know, one, when is the early history, right? And then you would need to know what high-level programming languages are being referred to, right? And then you would need to know what is data here in this sense, and then what is process here in this sense, and then what is abstraction here in this sense. And then once you know all those things, how long did it take to go from only process abstraction to data abstraction as well? What did that look like? What was an instantiation of that? What were some key insights that led to that? What's the utility of doing that? What were some limitations of only having process abstractions in the early on, in the early history of programming languages? These are the interesting things about this stuff. Not like what it was. It's what it means, what it implies, what it adds, what it changes. These things. That's the interesting piece of all this stuff. So that's my concern about these items, or this item in particular. And obviously I can't make that judgment because I don't know the full collection.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely feel like I have maybe not all of those that you mentioned, and I'll probably end up coming back to this podcast just so I can listen to this again and like make sure I do add in more, because this is actually something that really interests me, like the way we've decided to structure programming languages over time. It is interesting, and like you said, the really important part is why we decided to do those things, why those things became popular, and so on.
Right.
And so I will say this, like the you're not necessarily going to be able to add all of those things in at once. Like you probably wouldn't be able to make all of those items on the same day relating to this, but it's perfectly possible to do that incrementally over time. Like as you come back to this item and you think about, okay, yeah, what are like the limitations of only having process abstraction? What does data abstraction give me? And, has it been successful? Are people more productive now that they're able to use like data and process abstraction at the same time, and so on?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it's some stuff just needs to germinate. Like you just need to think on things for a long time. It's like when you're coding, it's almost impossible to land on the perfect implementation of something the first go.
Oh, yeah.
You have to implement it poorly and then wait for the project to build and complexify and add other things onto it. And then you go, oh, this way I did it was actually more rigid than I anticipated. There was more coupling than I thought there was. This kind of thing. I would like to be able to do this instead of that. And then you go back and change it, right? So I think your knowledge is the same as that. And some things are compressible in terms of learning time. Like if you just spent a bunch of hours in one day, you could probably learn it. But some things, the hours have to be spent over time. Otherwise, it doesn't seem to work or something. And I don't really know how to explain that. I don't know what the rules are for that in terms of what falls into one bucket or the other. But there are a lot of things that have to wait some time and process in the mind, and just go with that. That's fine. It's totally okay. It's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to change these items over time. You're supposed to delete the ones that are no longer useful. You're supposed to add the new ones that are related to the old ones once you realize further connections or a deeper understanding. So this is what's supposed to happen. This is not an exception. It's the rule.
Indeed. Okay, let's go on to the next one. This is one I quite like. Right. It's basically describing two very common operations that you would do over like a list or a collection of items. And so the first one is called a map operation, which is basically applying a function to every item in the list and creating a new list out of those items. And then the reduce, which takes all of the items in the list and sort of combines them somehow into one value. And so, yeah, this is like a really good visual representation of actually what's going on. It made it very intuitive to me. And one of the great things about map and reduce is that they're kind of like programming language invariant. I've used like maybe 5 programming languages at this point. Every single one of them has an implementation of the map and reduce functions, because they're just like really primitive functions that they come in handy a whole lot. So
yeah, it's very abstract.
Exactly. Yeah. They're really good to learn.
You can do almost anything with a map or reduce.
Right.
Like it's really surprising how much stuff you can do. And people are too rigid with when they're willing to move to a collection or an array or a list, because you can do a lot of stuff, unanticipated stuff with map and reduce and similar functions. So yeah, it's definitely, this is a really good item actually. And I like the way it's presented because like it's really integrated, like it's really intuitive. I do wonder, like, do you have any other items related to this?
I must do, because like, yeah, all of those sort of map reduce operations, all of the like functional tools that seem to come, like functional programming, it seems to have become quite popular over the past, I don't know how many years. I've only been programming for like a year and a half, but it seems to be all the rage now. All of the like big languages, JavaScript, Python, they all have like functional programming aspects to them, C# as well. And so all of these sort of operations are getting added in. And yeah,
right.
I must have a bunch of other stuff about functional programming and map and reduce as well.
Right. Yeah, and do you have, probably I would have one item where the things on the right are blanked out at once. Because sort of when you see, I don't know, I feel like you might get some interference between map and reduce. So you might want to recall them at the same time. And I know that seems to go against the minimum information principle. That's fine. I mean, there's some exceptions that I'm willing to make. But yeah, I'd be curious about trying like covering up, doing an inclusion with both of the components on the right side and then both of the components on the left side and then both of the labels. And then just seeing how that works. Just having those 3 separate items in addition to this one. And I assume there's another one where map is blanked out as well. So yeah, that's a very interesting item. And I think more things should be done this way. I have written a note on this, but I didn't flesh it out enough. But roughly, don't try to spot when you're trying to do the job of images with words. And sometimes people do that. And so there are often times where something is easier to explain or understand if you had an image like this, but people would try to use words. So if you can find an image that resonates with you and it makes sense to you, much better to do that than to use words.
Very true. All right, let's go on to the next one, which is it's similar in the sense that it tries to aim at something more conceptual, but I'm a little bit worried that the formulation wasn't perfect, especially in terms of perhaps the length of the answer. But basically what it's asking is, what is the value of an iterator in terms of abstraction? And iterators, they're kind of like the thing underlying many of sort of the collection data structures in many programming languages. Like I know Python has implementations of iterators, like C# does as well. And so again, it's like one of those programming language invariant things. The knowledge from this, as long as it's encoded well, which perhaps it wasn't, but as long as it's encoded well, it carries over, it transfers across all of the programming languages that you'll need to know like over your life, which is going to be a lot. I'll say this, like I was really surprised when I came into learning programming. I sort of thought of it more as like a almost like you were learning like a human language, and it would be similar in difficulty. It'd be something that you dedicate a lengthy period of time to just studying one. And that just hasn't been my experience with programming language. It's like, if you want to do anything nowadays, it feels like you need to know at least 2. And then like if you have a lot of different projects that you want to work on, you're not going to necessarily be able to use the one that's your favorite. You might need to be sort of pragmatic and switch it up and stuff like that. You might literally not have a choice.
Yeah.
So I feel like that has become more and more common. So looking for that generally applicable knowledge that you can apply to many different programming languages is really good. So I think that was a good part. How do you feel about, especially the answer? It feels like a little bit too long to me.
Yeah, I mean, even if you wanted to keep the same information conceptually in the answer, there's probably some ways to rephrase it that would be simpler. Like, instead of saying allows a user to traverse, you could say allows traversal or something like that, and just shorten it up that way. And there's some other shortenings you can make to just make it a little bit tighter. But I'd be curious, what associations, when you see this, what does it make you think of? What are the implications of this?
I think it's like the separation of the algorithm from the underlying data structure. That's the really important part. It's like, I guess it's quite common especially in object-oriented programming languages, to have like an interface, and then you sort of forget about the underlying implementation of the data structure, and you just call the methods on the interface, which sort of make up the algorithm part of things. That's the part that you sort of know more about, and then it operates the same way across the data structure. So to give more of a concrete example, this is getting a little bit deep in the weeds perhaps, but like if you had a list data structure and an array data structure, they're both different data structures, but the iterator and the way you iterate over a list and an array, it's basically the same when you're using a higher level programming language like C#. So that's like part of it, just the separation between algorithm and data structure. I guess that's the part that interests me. And also it's like, it's not only applicable to like the programming language itself, it's also like databases as well. Like the cursor, I don't know, I guess you must have heard of that before. Like the cursor that you use to traverse the rows in a database is the same concept as an iterator over a list. And so it's like, it sort of integrates things in an interesting way. So I do feel like it's worthwhile.
Do you have an item for that analogy? Like, what is the database equivalent of an iterator? Yeah, okay. So that's useful. Okay, so there's a couple. You have to know that when you think of internal structure, you're not actually referring to the shape of the data itself. You mean like a data structure. So you don't actually mean like the fields in a table, for example. You just mean the way that database tables are structured, this kind of thing. So it's referring to a data structure. So that's useful to know, and some people would probably have some ambiguity there. Of course, you probably don't, because this is the correct use of the word structure as far as I can observe. But yeah, I would probably add some more items about the implications and the value of that and particular components of the utility of it. So, or I would rephrase the question maybe a little bit, like from an abstract perspective, what is the value of an iterator, or what does an iterator allow you to do? Because really, it's not even talking about the value, right? So this is just explaining what it allows you to do. The value would be, in my intuition, would be more describing the benefits of being able to traverse a container and all of its elements, right? And so that would be my intuition there. And then if you were to keep this item, I would probably rephrase it to, because a lot of it is like over-explaining. So access every element of a container without knowing its internal structure. So I would probably say allows traversal of every element of a container without knowing its internal structure, or something like this. Just remove a bunch of the words so that it gets more quickly to what matters. But overall, I think it's a reasonable item, as long as there's a bunch of other supporting items about the actual benefits and the implications and analogous stuff, that kind of thing.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's good feedback. All right, here we go. The final one. Again, I think the formulation, the implementation of how I wrote the item probably wasn't the best. Again, feels like a little bit long, and I don't like the fact that I explicitly said CS analogy. I feel like that it almost cheapens the analogy in a little bit. It's not as nice as almost just leaving that out and seeing if I could derive the analogy just by itself, if you know what I mean. But I do like the attempt again to go for something more conceptual, and this time not just in terms of making it applicable to many different programming languages or other things within programming in general. This one tries to go beyond, and it tries to link the idea of an interpreter to DNA, so to biological systems, which I really like, because then it gives you the sense that computation is something universal that all organisms do. You know, I don't know. Do you get what I mean? It's trying to go for something very abstract and applicable almost.
So is this essentially trying to analogize RNA and ribosomes with an interpreter?
Yes.
Is that the analogy?
Yeah.
So I would probably phrase it more directly like that. Like what is it? I mean, you could even keep the computer science analogy thing. Like what is a computer science analogy for, RNA and ribosomes or whatever.
Yeah.
That, or what aspect of DNA is encoded in RNA and ribosomes or whatever it is. So I would probably phrase it like that. In general, I think these type of analogy items are great. I don't know. I often don't like items where there's a bunch of words after the close.
Yeah.
Because most of those are not remembered. And also you have to read to the end in order for it to make sense. And they tend to be much less useful in my view.
There was something, I think possibly the reason I left it in there was something very interesting to me, that the notion that the interpreter, like the DNA is the language and it encodes its own interpreter as well. That was enlightening. It was something like, I don't know exactly how to express it, but it gave me a feeling that, DNA was, I don't know all that much about Turing machines, but I think von Neumann came up with this idea of the universal constructor, perhaps, or something like that. Something that's able to generate itself almost. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but more items will be necessary to dig out the true value of this sort of idea. But
well, one thing you don't have to make an item out of is who invented that, because von Neumann invented almost everything. So there you go. It's pretty easy. But what's interesting about most of these things to me is that the interesting piece of it is not in there. It's the stuff that you think of afterwards. Suppose I said something completely silly to you, like slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? Suppose I said that to you. That phrase actually has no value in and of itself.
Yeah.
It's what it makes you think of. It's how it affects you, right? You would have to, in order to encode that phrase, if you were trying to remember the valuable part, you'd have to remember what it makes you think of, right?
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
No, I know exactly what you mean. The item is almost, it's very difficult to understand an item without the context, and the context is the entirety of that person's prior knowledge. So it's very difficult to understand. It's almost, the analogy Woz makes between, he comes up with this concept of learntropy. And so just to give a very, very quick rundown, because this metaphor that he makes is like one of the most just bamboozling ones. I don't know really why.
Convoluted.
Yeah. Okay, so there's this concept of Shannon entropy or whatever, or and it's from information theory, and it's like, how do you measure the amount of information in a signal, right? And basically the idea is that with Shannon entropy, you can measure the amount of information in a signal objectively. The amount of information is the same to me and Xander. It doesn't depend on our prior knowledge or our interpretation of the signal really at all. The difference is with Woz's learntropy is that it sort of takes into account all your prior knowledge. So while me and Xander might both measure the Shannon entropy of a signal as exactly the same, the learntropy would be very different, because it's based on like how it interacts with our prior knowledge. For example, if the semantic distance between my prior knowledge and that information is very far, I might not find it as interesting as Xander would, because he has the requisite prior knowledge to understand it. And so that's the difficulty that's the whole problem with trying to review items and trying to look at other people's items, is that if you don't have all of that context, something very different is going on inside the person who made that item's mind compared to yours.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that, but it actually wasn't precisely what I was referring to. I was referring to more of, in general, with most items, especially if they're conceptual, I think the interesting piece is what's thought of afterwards, what it makes you think of. Like I've been saying throughout the entire conversation, what are the implications of that? What does it mean? How is the world different before that? What would be the downside if you didn't have that? Or if things were different, what's another analogy you could make? Or things like this. It's implications, it's interpretation, it's extra thought. Because most times people will say, like, people will explain something and then they'll say, so basically, and then they'll say something else. That's an implication of that, or a simpler way to explain it, or an analogy, or something else. And those are the interesting pieces. The downside is almost nobody of all the items I've observed, and I've observed probably more items that are not my own than most people. Of all of the items I have observed, most people do not encode the interesting parts of information. They encode the most basic parts that are within the text. The most interesting parts of information, given the utility of prior knowledge, is not what's written. It's what's thought of after you read it. That's the utility. That's where the interesting piece is. And so I'm more inclined to write those kinds of items and give advice to people to write those kinds of items than I am to say, here's how to take a piece of text and turn this information into a set of items. I think that's very... I apologize for comparing myself to Bobby Fischer in advance, because I'm not Bobby Fischer. I'm not saying that I am, and at least in his later years, I certainly would hope I'm not. Right? But there is a video clip of Bobby Fischer on a private jet. I don't know what he's doing, but someone's trying to interview him about chess and all this, and he keeps wanting to go back to Fischer random. Fischer random is this idea, as far as I understand it, of like rearranging the back line of pieces on the board, so it's not rook and then knight and whatever else. Like you rearrange it. I don't exactly know the rules, but anyway, Fischer random is just like a little bit of variation and fun in the game of chess, so that you can't memorize like openings and stuff because it doesn't make sense. They no longer apply. So it's based on pure reasoning ability about chess, and so that's why he found it more interesting. And right now I feel like I'm trying to say, no, I wouldn't like to talk about this. I would like to talk about something more interesting, because the most boring piece of this to me is reading some text and encoding that in items. Like, to me, that's very clear how to do that. And to be honest, I believe that most people know how to do that really well. But what people can feel is that even though they can do that well, they're still not capturing the understanding and the feeling that they would like to capture. And that's because of this crucial point that's being missed, which is that most of the value when you learn something that is more conceptual is not directly encoded in what's written. It's what you think of after you read it.
So to make a good item requires an act of creativity, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, but you don't even have to try to be creative. Your brain will do this automatically. Like, I've mentioned examples of quotes before, right? When you like a quote, you have to say more words than the quote to describe why you like it. You have to. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So, like, I've given this example before. I don't remember if it was on a podcast or what, but there's this Nassim Taleb quote. I know you're his biggest fan.
I know you are too.
He says...
With the Nassim Taleb fan club right here.
That's right, dude. We're the biggest Nassim Taleb fans. He's the best guy, right? The nicest guy. Definitely not a bully. What a guy he is. Anyway, he has this quote. If you see fraud and do not say fraud, you are a fraud. Right? And so you think of that quote. And if I say that quote to you, it has no value unless you think of something. So you're watching someone and whatever, some fraud gets exposed and someone didn't point it out. Ordinarily, people would go, oh, well, they didn't do the fraud. But if they knew about it and they didn't point it out, they're a fraud too. And then if you're in a situation yourself where you see fraud, you go, oh my God, I can't let this happen. I'm part of this. I'm letting this go on. It actually changes your moral framework. And so the interesting piece of things is not the thing itself. It's what is thought of. And the delusion that people fall prey to, or maybe it's an illusion. I haven't quite put a fine point on it yet. But the problem is people assume that their interpretation of things will always be the same. So because I think of that when I hear that quote, my assumption is I will always think of that when I hear that quote, right? And so it's fine. First of all, that's not true. Like, you think of way different stuff over time, depending on how your knowledge changes, and you might have a creative association because you were learning something related at the same time, or whatever. And also, you want to have the association go both ways. So you don't want to just think of that quote when you see fraud. You want to think of fraud or think of that quote when you see things that are related, or think of that quote when you think about something like snitching or whatever, things like this. And so, that's the value of it to me. It's making items about the interpretation and the thoughts that you have and the ideas you have, the associations of reading things. That's the interesting piece of this game, not normal stuff, because that's very boring.
I think I agree with you mostly, but there is one thing that I think maybe is worth discussing. It's like perhaps people are they feel more confident just closing the original quote because that thing is immutable. The person said that thing. It's not going to change over time. You can feel safe almost closing it. Your interpretation of that of the underlying thing could change over time. By encoding, what you believe initially as an item, you might actually end up changing your interpretation and then perhaps having to change that close or whatever. Do you think there's is that an issue that your interpretation of the text could change over time? Therefore, is it a risk or whatever? Is it a waste of time to, sort of lock yourself into that view? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely know what you mean. I just don't think the point is not to write items about like the tiny things that you believe about it in such a way that you're locking yourself in, although that there can be some value in that. It's like, it's more about what would Nassim Taleb advise you to do in such and such situation, right? Or what would Nassim himself do in such a situation? Or what is a Nassim Taleb quote that would make our decision making easier in this particular situation? Or things like this. Those are the interesting things that I like about it. And yeah, I mean, you could write some stuff down about your interpretation that locks you in, and that wouldn't be ideal. But again, it's not like if you have an item, you're stuck that way of thinking forever. Yeah. Like, you're going to change no matter what. And having information in your brain allows you to make more informed decisions and change your beliefs in a really significant way, hopefully in a positive direction. So I'm not too concerned about the risk of that.
Yeah, actually, I'd be really interested to ask Woz what he thinks about that. It might even be the case that actually remembering your interpretation even immediately after reading the quote would make it easier to change your opinion over time, because you'd be able to retrieve that you'd had that interpretation, then criticize it almost in your mind why it was wrong or why it needs to be adjusted, and then you could then add the adjustment into your collection. So yeah, actually that's really interesting. Yeah, I wonder which way is better, and I bet it would. I bet it would be what you're suggesting. Actually, I bet that would be better. Interesting.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I hope I'm not giving advice that would, waste people's time. It's certainly possible that I'm going down the wrong path here, which is why, in the past, not so much recently, just because I no longer like to talk about items in a general sense. I used to. In the Discord context, I used to go into the Formulation lab channel and give advice, but most of the time, people don't understand what it is they're asking. And they don't understand what it is you're saying in response. Again, that is not an insult to anybody. It took me 5 or 6 years to get even close to good at this skill. So it's not an insult to anybody. I'm an idiot regarding this stuff as well. But I'm no longer interested in this in the general sense. So I no longer talk to people about it that much. But when I used to a lot, people would treat me like I know the definitive answer. I don't. There is no definitive answer to this. It's so personal, and it's so based on your prior knowledge and your interests and the particular context in which you hope to employ the information and your creative workflow and the field you're in and these kinds of things. And it's also based on how much knowledge you have about that particular thing and how it's going to change over time. So there's so much about this that is flexible and personalized. So none of this advice is like all or nothing. It's just some food for thought. And to me, I will stand firm, at least for now, that the most interesting part of this is not encoding what's in the text. It's encoding what you think about what you've learned.
Very nice. All right. Well, this was a lot of fun. I really got a lot out of this.
Fantastic.
This session. I hope people enjoyed it. And actually, I have an idea for perhaps a future video or a series of videos. We could do almost like a reformulation review, perhaps even taking some of the ones that we talked about today. And actually, I could perhaps even share my screen and we could go through like reformulating them, or, you know, trying to come up with the sort of creative connections, the ones that are really valuable, like you said. So yeah,
I would be really interested in that. And also, if somebody hears this and they want to just talk to me or you or both of us in private about their items, like, I would be interested in having a chat about this if you're not stuck in like, I have this item, how do I rephrase it? That's the most boring part of what you could ask. I'm not particularly concerned about that. If you're willing to have a more high level conversation, I would actually love to talk about this. Just message me and we can have a chat, or maybe James can join us as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you happen to hear this and you want to talk about that, just let me know and we can schedule a call.
This is such a niche area that we're kind of dying for more people to talk to. So yeah, do get in touch if you're interested. And yeah. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
See ya.